The moment my stepfather's hand slammed the door behind me, I understood something I'd been refusing to believe for years. The sound echoed down the porch steps and followed me all the way to the curb like it was something alive, something chasing me into the wet July heat. My mother stood behind the storm door, arms crossed, watching through the glass. She didn't even look sorry. That was the part that finally broke something loose inside me. I'd come back 2 months ago after the divorce. 31 days after I signed the papers, I lost the apartment that had been in my ex-husband's name. I had nowhere else to go, so I drove to the only house I'd ever called home and asked if I could stay just until I got back on my feet. My mother smiled and said, "Of course." My stepfather said nothing. What I didn't know was that coming back had set something into motion that neither of them ever expected. I'd been in the house for 53 days when it happened. I came home from my shift at the pediatric clinic, where I worked as a nurse's aide, to find my boxes already packed and stacked beside the front door. My laptop, my winter coats, a framed photo of my father that I'd kept on the nightstand, all of it shoved inside garbage bags and mismatched cardboard boxes, sealed with the kind of finality that felt rehearsed, like they'd been waiting for the right moment and had decided tonight was it. My stepfather handed me a paper. "You need to sign this before you take your things." I looked down at it. The print was small, the language was dense, and my name appeared 3 times in bold in the body of the text. The words "waiver of any and all inheritance rights pertaining to the estate of Dorothy Hargrove" landed like a stone in still water. My Aunt Dorothy, my father's sister, the woman who called me every Sunday until she stopped being able to hold the phone. "I'm not signing that," I said. His face changed. I'd seen that shift before, the way his expression went from controlled to something uglier underneath, the way it always did when he wasn't going to get what he wanted. "Your aunt left something," my mother said from behind him, her voice careful, rehearsed. "But the estate is complicated. We're just protecting the family from legal exposure. It's standard." "Standard," I repeated. Nothing about this felt standard. Where did this paper come from? "Sign it, Claire," my stepfather said. Not a request. I folded the paper in half and put it in my back pocket. My mother looked like she'd swallowed something sharp. I told them I needed a minute and went upstairs for the last time. I sat on the edge of the bare mattress in my childhood room and stared at the ceiling and thought about Aunt Dorothy, who used to sit on her front porch in a wicker chair and tell me I had my father's eyes. Who taught me to bake bread on rainy Saturday mornings? Who pressed something into my hand the last time I visited her in the care facility? Her fingers still strong even then, her gaze more focused than it had been in months. She'd said, "This goes to you, sweetheart. Not to anyone else. Just you." The object was still in the inner zipper pocket of my purse where I'd tucked it that day. A small brass key, old-fashioned, with a paper tag attached to it by a thin red cord. On the tag, in Aunt Dorothy's careful handwriting, "Meridian Trust. Ask for Margaret Soloway." I hadn't known what to do with it. Aunt Dorothy had slipped into a steep decline shortly after that visit, and the family had descended like weather. Everyone suddenly concerned. Everyone suddenly present. My stepfather had started making phone calls I wasn't included in. My mother had started explaining things to me in careful terms about estates and legal complexity and how it was all very difficult to navigate. Now I understood why. I carried my boxes to my car in 2 trips. My stepfather watched from the porch without offering to help. I didn't look at my mother again. When I got in the driver's seat, I put the key on the dashboard where I could see it and drove away from the house I grew up in. It was almost 9 in the evening. I sat in the parking lot of a Walgreens a mile away and looked up Meridian Trust on my phone. A small estate and legal services firm, established 1978, specializing in private trusts and inheritance management. There was a phone number and an address. The office opened at 8 in the morning. I slept in my car that night. I pushed the front seat back as far as it would go and covered myself with the cardigan I'd been wearing and listened to the parking lot sounds and thought about my father, who had died when I was 11. He had loved his sister. He'd talked about her often. And suddenly I was wondering what he would have thought about the paper my stepfather had tried to hand me tonight, about the folded waiver still sitting in my back pocket. I thought about it until sometime after 2 in the morning, and then I didn't think about anything at all. The office on Meridian Street was in an older brick building with a brass plate beside the door and window boxes full of white petunias. I arrived at 7:45 and sat on the low wall across the street and drank a gas station coffee and watched the door. At 8 on the dot, a light came on inside. At the front desk, a young man with reading glasses looked up and smiled. I told him I was there to see Margaret Soloway. I told him my name. I slid the key across the counter the way someone might offer a coin whose value they weren't sure of. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a kind of quiet recognition, the way a face adjusts when something unexpected becomes suddenly relevant. "One moment," he said, and picked up the phone. I sat in a chair near the window and watched a woman across the street water her window boxes. I told myself that this was probably nothing, that Aunt Dorothy had probably left me a few pieces of jewelry and an old sewing kit, that the waiver my stepfather had tried to get me to sign was an overreaction from a man who always overreacted. I told myself not to hope for anything because hoping for things was a good way to end up sleeping in your car for a second night. Margaret Soloway was a woman in her late 60s, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of composed, careful energy of someone who had spent decades handling situations that required composure and care. She shook my hand firmly, looked at the key, and then looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "Let's go somewhere private," she said. Her office smelled like old paper and coffee and something faintly floral. There were framed botanical prints on the walls and a window overlooking a small courtyard. She closed the door and gestured for me to sit. Then she sat across from me and folded her hands and said, "Miss Clare, how much do you know about your aunt's estate?" I told her honestly. "Almost nothing." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "Your Aunt Dorothy established a trust through our firm 19 years ago," she said. "She amended it 4 times over the years. The most recent amendment was executed 14 months ago, while she still retained full legal capacity. I want to make that clear before I continue. She was evaluated by 2 independent physicians at the time of the amendment. Both confirmed she was fully competent. Something in the careful emphasis of that last word settled in my stomach like a warning. "Who else knew about this trust?" I asked. Margaret paused. "Your stepfather contacted our office 8 months ago. He identified himself as a family representative and asked to discuss the estate. We declined to share any information with him, as he was not named in the documents and had no legal standing." She looked at me steadily. "He contacted us 3 more times after that. The air in the room felt different, closer." "What did my aunt leave?" I managed. Margaret turned her monitor so I could see it. She walked me through the first document slowly, explaining each section. A property trust, a private investment account, a stake in a small commercial real estate partnership that Aunt Dorothy had quietly held for 22 years. The numbers on the screen accumulated in a way that my brain kept refusing to process. I kept waiting for her to indicate the page where the real total was, the modest one, the one that made sense. She didn't. Because that page wasn't there. "The liquid assets alone are just over $4 million, Margaret said. "The property holdings and the partnership stake bring the total estimated value to approximately $11 million, depending on current market assessments." I put my hands flat on my desk and stared at the screen. $11 million. My aunt, who wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation and clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and drove a 12-year-old Civic and always said she was comfortable, but nothing more than that. "I don't understand," I said. "Your aunt was a very private person," Margaret said. "And a very deliberate one." She reached into a drawer and removed a sealed envelope. My name was on the front in Aunt Dorothy's handwriting. "She asked us to give this to you when you came in with the key." I took the envelope. My hands were steady in the way hands get when shock has passed through the other side of itself and become something numb. "There's more," Margaret said, and her voice had gone a half-degree softer. "Your aunt left a sealed file with this office. She instructed us to share the contents with you upon your arrival. She described it as context. Context. The word carried weight it wasn't supposed to carry." Margaret opened a second folder. The first page was a timeline. The kind that people make when they are building a record, when they know something needs to be proven. It started 7 years ago and ran through 14 months ago, entry by entry. I read it slowly. My stepfather's name appeared in the second entry. A request he had made to Aunt Dorothy directly, a loan, substantial, for a business venture. She had declined. There was a record of the refusal in her own handwriting, signed and dated. Below it, a note. Richard did not take this well. He has suggested that I am confused about the value of money. I am not confused. I read the next entry. And the one after that. My mother and stepfather had made 6 attempts over 5 years to gain control of Aunt Dorothy's finances. They had told her doctor she was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline, a complaint the doctor had investigated and dismissed. They had contacted her bank on 2 separate occasions, posing as her authorized representatives. They had encouraged her to move to a care facility of their choosing, one where the admission paperwork included a limited power of attorney clause buried in the 3rd page, a detail that the facility's own intake coordinator had flagged and refused to process. The last entry was dated 4 months before her death. Dorothy has asked to see Claire. I have passed the message along. Claire has not called back. I will write again. I looked up from the page. I never got any messages, I said. The words came out smaller than I intended. We know, Margaret said softly. Your aunt believed they were being intercepted. She documented her attempts. I pressed a hand over my mouth. I had thought, in the months after her decline, that she had simply stopped reaching out. I had thought she no longer recognized me. I had thought exactly what my mother had told me to think. I made myself look back at the file. There was more, a legal complaint Dorothy had filed with the State Elder Services Agency, which had opened and then closed an inconclusive review. Notes from her personal attorney describing pressure applied by my stepfather at a hospital visit. A short, fierce letter she had written to my mother directly. You are using my illness as a door you think you can walk through. You will not. Everything I have goes to Claire. That will not change. Do not contact me again. At the bottom of the file, a photograph. Aunt Dorothy and my father, young, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. On the back, in her handwriting, for when Claire needs to remember where she came from. I sat with the photograph for a long time. When I looked up, Margaret was watching me with the patient, steady expression of someone who had seen grief take every possible form. She loved you very much, Margaret said. I nodded. I couldn't speak yet. I want to make sure you understand the situation fully, Margaret continued. The waiver your stepfather asked you to sign last night would have surrendered your claim to the entire estate. It was not a standard legal document. It was drafted specifically to eliminate your rights under the trust. Something cold moved through me. He knew, I said. He knew what she left. Margaret nodded. He knew the general scope. He did not have access to specifics because we refused to provide them. But he knew enough. I thought about the boxes stacked by the front door. The timing of it. 53 days of letting me stay. Of waiting for the right moment. Of whatever sequence of phone calls and legal consultations had preceded that neatly folded paper in my back pocket. They had planned this. All of it. My mother's careful voice saying it was just about legal exposure. Her arms crossed through the storm door glass. Not sorry. Watching. I reached into my pocket and put the unsigned waiver on Margaret's desk. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. I need a lawyer, I said. Your aunt anticipated that, Margaret said. She slid a business card across the desk. James Whitfield. Elder Law and Estate Litigation. Dorothy retained him specifically for this circumstance. I picked up the card. I looked at Margaret. She prepared for this? For years, Margaret said quietly. She was afraid they would isolate you from the truth. She tried to make sure the truth had somewhere safe to wait. The letter was still sealed in my hand. I opened it there, in the quiet of Margaret's office, with the morning light coming in through the courtyard window. My darling Claire, if you are reading this, it means you found your way to the key. It means they did not get to you first, or that they tried and you were stronger than they counted on. Either way, you're here. And I need you to know something I should have said a long time ago. Your father and I grew up without much, and we built our lives the only way we knew how. Quietly, steadily, without announcing it. What I have built belongs to you, not because of obligation, because you are the one who came to visit when there was nothing to gain from visiting. Because you are the one who held my hand and talked to me like I was still a full person when other people had already started talking about me in the past tense. You are your father's child, Claire. You always were. Take this and do something good with it. Build something real. And please do not let them tell you it was ever complicated. It was never complicated. It was always yours. All my love, Aunt Dorothy. I sat with the letter pressed to my chest for a moment. Then I stood up, and something shifted in me. Not a dramatic shift, not the kind that changes the temperature of a room, but the quiet, interior kind. The kind that feels like a door opening into air. Tell me what happens next, I said. James Whitfield's office was 3 floors up in a glass building 6 blocks away. I called on the walkover and he answered himself, which surprised me. He said he had been expecting my call eventually. He said that as if he had been waiting for me the way you wait for a delayed train, not impatiently, but with the certainty that it was coming. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, unhurried in the way of someone who had dealt with enough crises that they no longer registered as such. He looked at the waiver before he looked at anything else. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My stepfather handed it to me last night," I said. "Right before he told me to leave." He set it down with the particular care of someone handling evidence. "Miss Claire," he said, "I have been managing your aunt's legal affairs for 9 years. In that time, your stepfather has attempted, through 6 separate channels, to access or redirect her assets. Each attempt failed because your aunt was meticulous and because this office was careful." He folded his hands. "What happened last night tells me he has become impatient. What does that mean for me? It means we need to move quickly," he said. "And it means we have everything we need to do so." He walked me through it the way Margaret had calmly, thoroughly, layer by layer. The estate was clean. The trust was airtight. Aunt Dorothy's competency had been documented and preserved specifically to prevent a challenge. The waiver I'd been handed had no legal force, because it had never been signed, but its existence was itself a significant piece of evidence. Evidence of intent. Evidence of prior knowledge. Evidence that my stepfather had been aware of the estate's contents through means that deserved scrutiny. "He tried to get documents from this office," James said. "He obtained, through parties we are still identifying, a partial summary of the estate's value. Someone with access to our intake records shared information that should not have been shared." I stared at him. "Someone here? A former contractor?" he said. "Terminated 14 days ago once we identified the breach. The matter has been referred to the state bar. The insider. Found. Dealt with. I want to know what I can do," I said. "Right now?" 3 things. First, open a personal account at a bank your stepfather has no connection to, and transfer enough from the estate to take care of yourself immediately. You should not be sleeping in your car while this resolves. Second, do not respond to any contact from your mother or stepfather. Anything they send goes directly to me. Third, he paused. "Have you used the estate funds at all yet?" "No," I said. "I only found out this morning." "Use them," he said simply. "Your aunt left them to you so that you could start living." I checked into a hotel that afternoon. A real one. Not a roadside motel, a downtown hotel with a doorman and clean white linens and a bathroom where the water pressure worked and a window that looked out over the river. I sat on the edge of the bed and called room service and ordered a real meal, and while I waited for it I transferred enough from the estate account to cover 3 months of reasonable living. Then I sat with the letter from Aunt Dorothy and read it one more time. She had known. She had seen what was coming before I could. 2 days later, my mother called 7 times. My stepfather's number appeared twice. I forwarded everything to James and blocked them both. On the morning of the 3rd day, James called me. "Your stepfather filed an emergency petition," he said. "What kind?" "He's claiming your aunt was unduly influenced in the final amendment of the trust. He's alleging that you, quote, cultivated a relationship with a vulnerable elder for financial gain." The specific phrasing hit me somewhere that hurt. "That's what I did when I visited her," I said. "Cultivated a relationship." "Yes," James said, and his voice was careful. "It's a tactic. If we allow it to proceed unchallenged, it triggers an automatic review courts, social services, possible delays to your access. It is designed to make you feel like the ground is moving. What do? "We respond," he said. "And we respond with everything Dorothy gave us." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I found out through James, who had heard from a county records clerk, that my stepfather had quietly taken out a second mortgage on the house he and my mother shared 18 months ago. Around the time the first phone calls to Meridian Trust had started. Around the time someone at that firm had started leaking information they shouldn't have. He had been counting on this. He had been building toward it the way someone builds toward a thing they've convinced themselves they deserve. I spent the days before the hearing learning how to exist in a life I hadn't had before. I bought groceries and cooked in the hotel's small kitchenette. I walked along the river in the mornings. I called the pediatric clinic and gave them 3 weeks' notice because I was going to need time to work through what came next. On the 4th morning, I met Daniel. He was in the hotel lobby, sitting in one of the side chairs with a laptop and a coffee, wearing a shirt that suggested he'd been working since early and hadn't thought much about it. He looked up when I walked past and then looked down, and I would have kept walking except that the chair next to him was the only one near an outlet, and my phone was at 4%. I asked if the seat was taken. He said it wasn't. We sat in companionable silence for 20 minutes. Then he asked if I was in town for work. "Not exactly," I said. He didn't push. I appreciated that. He told me he was a structural engineer, in town to consult on a renovation project downtown. He had a quiet way of speaking, and a steady, unhurried manner that I found myself relaxing into before I realized I was doing it. I told him a version of things, not the numbers, not the specifics, just that I was dealing with a family situation and some unexpected legal work and trying to figure out what came next. He listened the way that some people listen, without filling the silence too quickly. "Is the family situation the kind where you're going to be okay?" he asked. It was a direct question, but not a prying one. It had the quality of something that mattered to the person asking. "I think so," I said. "I have a good lawyer." He smiled. "That's half the battle." I didn't expect to see him again, but the hotel was small and we were both there for the week, and on the second evening we ended up at adjacent tables in the restaurant, and he asked if I wanted to just push them together. We talked for 2 hours over dinner. He asked me about nursing. I asked him about buildings. He told me about a project he'd done in Portugal 2 years ago that had changed how he thought about space and light. I told him about the day I'd found out I was getting divorced, and how I'd gone for a 3-hour walk and ended up at a park I'd never been to, and sat on a bench and watched pigeons and felt, for the first time, completely free of something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "That's not a sad story," he said. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't, once I got through it." He was careful with me in the way of someone who understood, without being told, that careful was what was needed. He didn't ask about my stepfather. He didn't ask about the legal situation. He said, on the 3rd evening, "I don't want you to feel like you have to explain anything to me. I just like talking to you." Something loosened in my chest. Something I hadn't realized was clenched. The morning of the hearing, Daniel knocked on my door at 7:30 with 2 coffees from the place down the street and said he thought I might want company for the first 30 minutes of the day. He sat with me while I got ready. He didn't say much. When I picked up my bag and my folder of documents and stood at the door, he said, "You've already done the hardest part." I thought about the night I'd refused to sign that paper, about driving away from the house I'd grown up in, about walking into a brass-plated office with a little key on a red cord and asking for Margaret Soloway. "Yeah," I said. "I think you're right." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. James stood beside me in a dark suit that gave off the energy of someone who had spent years in rooms like this and was not impressed by any of them. Across the aisle, my stepfather sat very straight, his attorney beside him, his expression set into the particular configuration of a man who has rehearsed certainty. My mother was there too, farther back, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me once when I walked in and then looked away. The judge was a woman in her 60s who looked like she had heard every version of every story and was prepared to hear one more. My stepfather's attorney spoke first. She made the undue influence argument carefully, framing Aunt Dorothy as an isolated elderly woman, framing me as someone who had used access and proximity to shape a generous but confused old woman's final wishes. She used the word vulnerable 4 times. She used the word manipulated twice. James stood. He was very calm. He introduced Aunt Dorothy's physician evaluations first. 2. Independent competency assessments, both conducted within the 14-month window of the final amendment, both concluding the same thing: fully competent, no impairment, no clinical basis for concern. He introduced them without drama, just factual. Here they are. This is what they say. Then he introduced the records from Meridian Trust, the 6 attempted contacts by my stepfather, the requests refused, the documented efforts to gain access to information he had no legal right to access. He introduced the letter Aunt Dorothy had written to my mother directly, the one that said, "You will not walk through this door." He introduced the Elder Services complaint. He introduced the waiver. The courtroom went still when he held it up. "This document," James said, "was presented to my client on the evening she was removed from the family home. She was told it was standard. It was not standard. It was drafted by a third-party attorney retained by the petitioner, and it was specifically designed to eliminate my client's standing under the trust. The petitioner was aware of the trust's contents through information obtained in breach of confidentiality. The breach has been documented. The party responsible has been referred to the state bar." My stepfather's jaw was very tight. James introduced one final item: a short video, recorded at Aunt Dorothy's request by James himself, 8 months ago. She was in her chair by the window of her room at the care facility, a different one than my stepfather had suggested, the one she had chosen herself. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked directly at the camera and spoke in a clear, unhurried voice. She said my name. She said she was of sound mind and full intention. She said that everything she had built over her lifetime was for the girl who used to come visit her on Sunday afternoons and help her tend the tomato plants on the back porch. She said that no one had told her what to do or how to feel about any of it. She said she had made her choices clearly and carefully, and without outside influence. She said she loved me, and she said it like a fact, the way you state something you have no doubt about. I heard my mother make a small sound from the back of the courtroom. The judge called a brief recess. When she came back, she was carrying a printed copy of the summary James had submitted. She looked at my stepfather's attorney. She looked at the documents. She looked at the video still frozen on the screen. She looked at the waiver. "Petition denied," she said. Her voice was flat and final, the way a door sounds when it actually closes. "Furthermore, I am referring the matter of the waiver and the documented breach of client confidentiality to the appropriate regulatory authorities for review. I would also suggest that counsel for the petitioner review their obligations carefully in light of the materials presented today." My stepfather stood up. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He sat back down. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, I stood with my back against the wall and took 3 slow breaths. James came out a minute later and shook my hand. "That's as clean as it gets," he said. "Will he try again?" "He can try," James said. "He won't have anything left to try with. The financial irregularities around that second mortgage are going to generate attention on their own. The bar referral will generate attention. And he's out of legal avenues." He looked at me with something that was close to warmth, but was mostly professional satisfaction. "Your aunt built a very strong wall around this, Claire. She thought of everything. I thought of her in the wicker chair. I thought of her hands, the strength still in them even at the end. I thought of the key she had pressed into my palm with such deliberate certainty. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had known for years. I walked out of the building into the warm afternoon and sat on the steps and looked at the street. People walked past. Cars moved. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The world was just going on the way it always did, indifferent and ordinary, which felt, in that moment, like the most comforting thing I'd ever seen. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "How did it go?" I typed back, "It went. I'll tell you about it tonight." He sent back a single word. "Good." I sat there a little longer. Then I got up and started walking. In the weeks that followed, I did the things I had never let myself do before. I opened a real bank account in my own name at an institution no one in my family had ever used. I called a real estate agent and started looking at apartments, not the kind you settle for because they're all you can afford, but the kind that have a room where you might want to sit and read on a Sunday morning, the kind where the kitchen gets afternoon light. I called the pediatric clinic and offered to consult part-time while I figured out whether I wanted to go back to school. They said yes. I went through Aunt Dorothy's belongings, the ones from the care facility that had been boxed and stored. In one of the boxes, I found the 3 cardigans. I found the coupon organizer she'd kept in her purse. I found a photograph album that had my father in every 3rd picture, smiling with his arm around his sister, the same eyes I saw in my own reflection. I understood something, looking at those pictures. She hadn't saved quietly all those years because she was afraid of spending. She had saved because she was building toward something, because she had watched her brother's daughter grow up in a house where love was conditional and access was controlled, and she had decided, with the quiet ferocity of someone who loves a person completely, to make sure that one day there would be no more conditions. My stepfather's 2nd mortgage went into default 3 weeks after the hearing. He and my mother moved into a rental. I heard about it through a distant cousin who meant well and texted me about it like it was news I would find satisfying. I didn't feel satisfied, exactly. I felt something more complicated than that, something that had room in it for grief and relief, and the weight of knowing that the people who were supposed to protect you spent years doing the opposite, and that the only response to that which doesn't hollow you out is to build something so solid they can never reach it. Daniel's consulting project in town wrapped up at the end of the month. On his last evening, we walked along the river, which had the particular gold light of late summer on it, the kind that makes everything look slightly more true than usual. He asked me what I was going to do next. I had been thinking about it. The apartment I'd found had a small guest room I was planning to furnish as a studio I'd been drawing again. Something I hadn't done since college, and there was something happening in those drawings that I wanted to follow. I was going to take a course in estate planning, not because I needed to, but because I had discovered, in the past weeks, that understanding how things were built and protected was something I found genuinely interesting. I was going to tend the tomato plants that I'd found, dried and dead, in Aunt Dorothy's storage boxes, and I was going to grow them again the way she had taught me, in whatever outdoor space my new apartment had, even if it was just a window box. "I'm going to stay here for a while," I said. "I like the river." Daniel looked at the water. "I'm not that far away," he said. "A couple hours north." "I know." He looked at me. There was something careful and honest in his expression that I had come to recognize as just the way he looked at things he wanted to understand. "I'd like to come back sometime," he said. "If that's something you'd want." I thought about the night I'd sat in the Walgreens parking lot with a key on my dashboard and no clear idea of what came next. I thought about Aunt Dorothy's handwriting on that small tag, the red cord, the deliberateness of it. I thought about every room I'd been in since then and how different a room felt when you knew you were allowed to take up space in it. "That's something I'd want," I said. The following Sunday, I drove to the cemetery where Aunt Dorothy was buried. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the light is still low and the grass is wet and the whole world feels like it hasn't quite started yet. I brought tomatoes from the farmer's market because it was what I had, and it felt right. I stood at her grave for a while without saying anything. Then I said the only thing that seemed worth saying. "I found my way to the key," I told her. And I kept it. The light moved in the trees above me. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was working through its morning, methodical and sure. I had inherited more than money from my aunt. I had inherited proof. Proof that someone had seen me clearly. Proof that love, when it is real, plans ahead. Proof that the story my stepfather had wanted to write about me, unstable, malleable, easy to move, had never once been the true one. I walked back to my car in the rising morning light and drove toward the apartment I was signing the lease on that afternoon, the one with the kitchen window and the small outdoor space just big enough for a few pots of tomatoes. I was, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, exactly where I was supposed to be.